Today it's our delight to be speaking with Noel Becchetti. Noel Becchetti is Vice President for Leader Development at Asian Access and served as an editor on the project that we'll be discussing today, Eastern Voices, Volume 1, Insight, Perspective, and Vision from Kingdom Leaders in Asia in Their Own Words. Noel, it's wonderful to be speaking with you today.
Well, thanks. Great to speak with you.
Noel, this is a unique book. You compile stories from leaders within Asian Access's network concerning the lessons that they have learned and some of the challenges that they've faced as they've served the church within the Asian context. First of all, would you be willing to share a little bit about the work of Asian Access that's brought you in touch with these specific leaders?
Sure. Asian Access is actually celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. It began as a mission in Japan, working with local pastors. And about 15 years in, the founder of Asian Access sensed that an acute need in Japan was the development and support of leaders, especially church pastors. That so many of the leaders, great hearts, great call to serve, but they were homegrown, didn't necessarily have a lot of training and did not have a lot of support, and there were a lot of problems that created. So the shift began into leader development, and about 20 years ago, people from other countries began to hear about our model, and our model is a learning community. Small groups of 12 to 15 leaders will commit to spend 2 years together, 8 concentrated times over 2 years. So it's pretty in-depth. They build some pretty deep relationships, lifetime friendships, and also, in a sense, learn together and do life-on-life kind of peer training in terms of how they can deepen their own personal relationships with God and also how their ministries can deepen and improve. So in the last 15 years or so, Asian Access has expanded where now we're active in 12 countries with pastoral leader development. And we've got a track now for business CEOs, Christian leaders in the marketplace, and that's active in 2 countries. So that's, in a nutshell, what we do.
Noel, how did you identify the specific contributors to this volume?
Well, the vision for this actually came from one of our veteran leaders. He is our Japan National Director. And as a young teenager, his father wanted him to learn English and said, hey, there's a church nearby teaching English. You go there. And that's how he became a Christian, through the founder of Asian Access. So he's been in the movement for 30 years. And he has felt for decades that there are leaders in Asia who have things to share that are going to be of benefit to the greater body of Christ. And the challenge is, how do we get their voices out there? How do we get their perspectives out there where people can benefit from them? English is still the international language, so that was a piece of it. And the challenge there is, how do you do that so that it's not lost in translation? That often well-meaning people can try to share what they've heard from friends in other countries, but maybe it gets lost in the translation. Just sort of divine circumstances. A lot of my background's in publishing. So when I got involved with Asian Access, they decided, well, I wonder if there's a way to access that experience. And I began to do work with our leaders in the movement when there were things in English that they wanted communicated. I worked with them on that. So Takeshi Takazawa, that director, said, you know, I think this might be our opportunity. We've got someone who might be able to work with our leaders and help them identify what they really want to share to the greater body of Christ and help them do it in English. So those leaders in that book are all people out of our movement. So they're all core leaders or the spouses of core leaders in Asian Access.
And Noel, what is Asian Access's specific hope for the result of this interesting volume?
Well, first and foremost, it's the empowerment of those leaders. Part of the challenge in cross-cultural missions, especially historically from, in this case, let's say west to east, is, the reality is the West has come in, especially with resources and a sense that we have experience, we have training. Our colleagues in the East, frankly, have a lot to teach us, but there's there's some issues with people in the East feeling like, oh yeah, well, all the experts come from the West, all the resources come from the West. Who are we? You know, we're sort of second class. It's not true, but that is a perception we're always dealing with. And so one of the long-term missions or visions of Asian Access is it is the elevation of the leaders God has called and raised up in Asia who will lead the church across Asia and frankly around the world. So we believe that there are first-class leaders there, and they've always been first-class leaders. Part of it is helping them understand they actually are first-class leaders and they do have something to say, and let's get that out there. So first and foremost, our goal was to continue to generate the legitimate sense of empowerment among our leaders. And we knew that being able to get that material out in writing, in English, where people could access it would be a benefit that way. It's called Volume 1 for a reason. We do think there are more voices to be heard, and also we want leaders in Asia, both ones we know, but maybe ones we don't yet know, but they can get that volume, look at it and say, hey, I could do that. I have something to say. And so we want more and more of the leaders to realize they have something to share and that the greater ministry world does want to hear from them.
This is really a very exciting project. May I ask if there are specific plans in place for a Volume 2 or perhaps others down the road?
There is. Where we're at in the process is we timed the release of this book with our 50th anniversary celebration, which began in April in Indonesia. We're still in the process of some major events related to the 50th anniversary. The last big event actually takes place this weekend in the United States. When the smoke clears from all of that activity, there's a debrief and kind of future think planned later in the fall where we want to sit down and assess what happened with the first volume, what we're happy about, what we think could be improved. But we've been also collecting ideas from our constituency to say, okay, what could the future look like? It could include more printed material, but there's also visions for video material, other ways, other media that could be used. And also, are there some in-person encounters, some leadership conferences and workshops that could be more Asian-led that could be a part of this? So the book is what it is as a book, but it's also hopefully part of a larger process of, again, the positioning of leaders in Asia to take more and more in charge of what's happening in terms of gospel advancement in the region.
Noel, let's talk for a moment about theological education in the Asian context. One of the reoccurring themes of the book is the need for theological education in Asia. What type of theological education is needed today? When we use the language of theological education in the West, we have a pretty specific idea of what we mean: university level, seminary training. What type of theological education is really needed in the Asian context today?
Well, what's really needed, and it's mentioned a few different times in the book, is the Asian educational context in general tends to emphasize intellect, rote learning, answering the right questions on tests, and it can be a pretty rigid system. So unfortunately, that rigidity and intellectual focus spilled into Christian education as Christians came into the region and schools got started. So there's lots of theological education in Asia, but the challenge is most of it is focused on intellectual, head-based stuff, very little on the heart, very little on personal relationship with God, very little on your inner character. So we have lots of leaders who will say, oh, I know all the theological stuff, but I have no relationship with God. I have all the intellectual material, but the cultural expectation for a minister in my culture is you're supposed to just totally concentrate on your ministry and you ignore everything else, including your family. And so your families are falling apart, your kids are falling apart. So the biggest shift is the education needs to expand to include heart issues, character issues, life issues. and practical issues in terms of what does it really take to run a church, or what does it take to lead a congregation or lead Christians. Now, in fairness, I think those are some of the same issues that Western theological education suffers from. You know, you probably have heard, I've heard it a million times, pastors who go, yeah, they call it seminary, but it was really cemetery. That there's the same issues, the overemphasis on head knowledge, lack of emphasis on personal character development, on your life with Christ. Excuse me. So I think it's a global problem, but it is an acute problem in Asia because the culture in general values so much that intellectual process, certificates, diplomas, and not so much the actual what the education can do for you. That would be the key, is really making it more holistic and comprehensive, and emphasis on the heart and life application.
Are there specific examples of theological education that Asian Access really looks to as exemplary in the Asian context?
Well, it's evolving. For example, Peter Musumder, who wrote the chapter in the book on the issues with lack of Bible teaching that's compelling in Bangladesh, and it's really connected to the educational system. He runs a student movement. In the U.S. they would call it InterVarsity. In Bangladesh, it's part of what they call International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. Well, he's really trying to work with young people, young adults, in making the Bible education more whole life and more heart-based. So the hope is, as those young adults go out, now many are just going into the workforce, but some are going to go into the ministry, that's going to change things up. But it's a tough issue. In terms of exemplary, I honestly can't yet give you any examples of that. There's a growing awareness. That the good news is, generally, more and more leaders in Asia are aware that there's a problem. Changing it's going to take time. And humans are conservative by nature. That's reflected in Asian cultures. They can be pretty conservative. Change can come slowly. So it's an issue, and they're still early in the process.
How might Western institutions of theological education best participate in this need for theological education that you identify in this text, Eastern Voices?
Well, we have, on an informal basis, and just to contextualize who we are what's known as part of the non-formal education movement. And there's sort of an evolving kind of process right now in the educational world in general about the effectiveness of formal education as distinct from the effectiveness of non-formal. And non-formal is kind of growing because more and more people are seeing the limitations of formal. So that said, we've got institutions like Fuller Seminary and Gordon Conwell who have been very supportive of what we're doing. Both of them have endorsed what we do. Now, they don't give us any credit because we're non-formal, but our leaders do go through a graduation process. And so when our leaders graduate from Asian Access, Fuller does endorse, and the president of Fuller does sign the certificate of graduation, even though, again, just for clarity, Fuller and Gordon Conwell, nobody's issuing specific credit. It's just not set up that way. But it's part of the whole move toward non-formal education, and possibly where non-formal education can ultimately be as effective or more effective in terms of producing real ministry results than sometimes formal education might be able to do.
Noel, would you be willing to share with us perhaps one of the greatest surprises that you faced when compiling this anthology?
Oh, absolutely. The biggest surprise was the willingness of the leaders to be honest and to be direct in what they were saying. The Asian context is very indirect. It's very much, they're honor-shame cultures. So preserving your face is really critical. So not offending others is very critical. And so people will avoid anything in terms of direct input or confrontation because culturally that's a huge issue. And in fact, early in the process, just quickly, the way that most of the chapters developed, because we were asking these leaders to operate in second, third, or fourth languages in writing is most of the chapters developed by conversation. I sat down and talked with the leaders. We talked about what was they wanted to share. I took notes, would draft things, and then come back with them, and we would just keep redrafting and redrafting through conversation until they were comfortable with it. Well, what would typically happen is we would have that first conversation. They'd give me great feedback. I'd write up a narrative. I'd send it back, and they'd go, "Oh, I can't say this. No, I mean, I can't. There's no way I could do that because that would hurt people's feelings." And we totally honored that. Nothing got published that was not with the complete permission of the authors. So there's stuff that doesn't appear in that book because ultimately people, weren't comfortable with it, and we respected that. But there was the process. I'll give you, Peter's as an example because I know he'd be okay with me sharing this. He had that reaction. He shared what he shared. And, oh, I don't know. This would hurt feelings. And I said, okay, understand that. We're not here to hurt anybody's feelings. But is this a real issue in Bangladesh? Is the gospel being crippled because people are not trained to teach the Bible compellingly and you can't reach people? He goes, well, yes. Is this some of the reason why this issue exists? Yes. Would you like to see that change? Yes. Is it possible that getting this information out will help be part of that change? Ultimately, he walked through that process and thought, okay, I'm not trying to hurt feelings here, but I see the point. I guess I'm willing to take that risk and put that out there. In no way he's trying to honor everybody, but this is a reality in our culture. And that was a consistent, if you read those chapters, those guys are being pretty honest. And so I know that there's, that when that book went out, there's going to be feedback and pushback. And so I really respect them for being willing to be that honest, especially in writing, because once it's in writing, it's out there. You can't take it back. So I really, we're in their debt, frankly.
Noel, I'm very grateful for your explanation thus far. Would you be willing to share one or two of your favorite stories from within the book?
Well, the opening chapter, that was Wesley Chotara from Myanmar. When I'm a new person in Asian Access. I'm just starting my 6th year, so I'm one of the new kids on the block. And when I first came into Asian Access, one thing I wanted to do was get to each of the countries and spend time with our directors when the program was not happening. I mean, just a chance to spend some time, get acquainted with them, and develop the relationships. And so when I got to Myanmar, it just so happened it was over a weekend, so I was going to be in Wesley's church and, just be there and attend. Now, Wesley, and you see this in the chapter, he was pastoring the preeminent Methodist church in Myanmar. He had worked his way all the way to the top. It's called the English, medium church. It's where the diplomats go. Basically, you go from there to be bishop for the Methodists in the whole country, and that's what he was being groomed to do. Thing was, I'm in this service, and I'm just going, something's not right here. There is a bad vibe in this church. And I'll be honest, I'm a Westerner. I was raised in the Western culture, so I wouldn't say I'm particularly spiritually sensitive. I have sort of that Western skepticism about things. But in the East, you learn fast. Spiritual reality is in your face all the time. So I've learned that a little more, but this was early on. So I'm like, I'm not this spiritually sensitive person, but I feel a pretty heavy spirit in this church. And as he was even preaching, I was going, this guy, something's not right. He just looks oppressed. Well, what I did not know at the time is he was in the late stages of going, I'm living a lie. I mean, this is a career, but I'm spiritually dead. What am I going to do? It all, he shares that in the chapter. So when we are getting to the book project, he was literally going through all that. And I was like, well, are you willing to, this is really the most important thing in your life. Are you willing to share this? And he was. Well, the thing is, he's a new guy. I mean, Wesley is a new man. Now when I'm there and I'm there fairly, it's just like, it's a different person. And so, just to have met him, nice guy, but, great guy, but I'm thinking, something's not right here. Figure out what it was. And then through this project, even help him unpack what that was like. And then again, his wife writes, somewhat of a parallel chapter later in the book from her perspective as a woman leader. But just to actually have kind of walked through that by God's circumstantial grace, and to see what he was like before and to see what he's like now, it's been pretty fun.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Noel. Is there another story that you'd care to share about the publication process and the surprises you encountered?
The three of the chapters in there, you'll note, we don't identify the authors because they're in countries we're trying to protect. And, probably discerning readers are going to catch what some of those countries are, but we're still trying to protect people. But I think one of the most intriguing examples, and I think it's the last chapter in the book, and it's the leader. He's in a dictatorial country where if you're a Christian, you're being watched, you're being tracked. And his whole process of getting into ministry, getting assigned a minder, and then finally going, okay, wait a minute. I can, most of my friends who are in this situation, they confront these people, they throw Bible verses at them, they're hostile. He goes, what if this police guy who's trying to oppress me, what if he's part of my ministry? Rather than being this adversary, what if I actually looked at him as part of my ministry? What if we actually became friends? And they did, and so that you read that story. Because in that country, what they do is when they want to start bugging you, they schedule tea time. So we're going to come over and have tea, and then we'll chat. Hey, well, how you doing? Great. How's your daughter who goes to such and such school that we know exactly her schedule is? And how's your wife doing at this job? And we know where, it's just a way that they want you to know they're tracking you the whole time. Well, they've become these friends where these people are sharing, they're unburdening their lives with this guy, because they're under all sorts of pressure. And as you, you'll see in the chapter, the main guy he was working with, he's not his caseworker anymore. I mean, they took him off the case and they're still friends. So that was, and that's still ongoing. I mean, that is a real time, that relationship is still in process, and he's seeing how that's going. That, just intrigued the heck out of me.
This is an absolutely fascinating book and a fascinating collection of stories. There are so many stories that are represented here in this book, but there are countless stories that are not yet represented, not only in this book, but in any media type. Does Asian Access have plans, or do you as individually have ideas on how more of these precious stories from Christian history ongoing today could be gathered and shared?
Well, in addition to whatever we hope to do into the future, we would love to see other organizations, other ministries simply look at the book and, just like individual leaders, say, hey, we could do that. In other words, I would love to see ministries who are committed to Asia, frankly, other places in the global South and so on, that maybe have the opportunity to say, can we help get the stories of our leaders into the greater community, which currently English is the medium that you do that in? Can we help them do that so that we get captured? Yeah. We're very excited to do this book. We're hoping it gets a lot of good reception. We're not expecting to make any money on it. I mean, that's just the way it is with something like this. So I understand that it's an investment anybody would have to make, but I think it's an investment worth making because, as you say, hopefully we're not just capturing stories to make people feel good. These folks have perspectives and experience in ministry we think can frankly be of benefit to others in the world. And a lot of what's happened in the East is beginning to happen in the West as we become post-Christian. So in other words, stuff we're confronting in our culture for the first time, they've been dealing with in Asia for hundreds of years. So they have a lot of experience to bring to the table. Global South, same thing. And so I think, in addition to them being inspirational and encouraging, I think there's a lot of practical advice these folks have that are going to be of great interest to the rest of the, ministry world anywhere we find ourselves. But it's going to be organic. I think hopefully people see it, they get inspired, they go, we can do that too. Go for it. That's what we say.
And Noel, if I can close with a question that I've been asking everyone on this program, and that is this: what would it mean for the church to be united today? How would we recognize this unity, and what is it that we can do as individual Christians to pursue the unity for which Jesus prayed in John 17?
Well, the first and foremost thing is people actually beginning to trust each other a little bit and let their guards down and become authentic friends. That's just a huge issue. And unfortunately, people in the ministry world mistrust each other just as much as anywhere else. And that's a huge issue everywhere, including in Asia. Asian cultures in general, you're trained not to trust other people. It's built into the historical cultures. You have lots of oppressive governments where you're also able, because you don't know who's an informer in your midst. But you put all that together, what it creates in Asia is you have leaders that are elevated and isolated. So they have a lot of power. There's guru cultures, but they're expected to do everything themselves. And you absolutely are not supposed to trust anybody else, because if you do, they're just going to try to take your position. They're going to try to undercut you. It's the biggest challenge we have in Asian Access. When those groups get together at first, they're not going to trust each other. That's why we have small groups and we work over a long period of time. But when they begin to get to know each other and begin to trust each other and say, gosh, I can actually have friends. I can actually have colleagues in the ministry. There's people who actually understand my problems and so on. I mean, when that kicks in, like our director in one of our really restricted countries, he said, oh man, we're totally trained not to trust anybody, because any group you have is going to have informers in it, for starters. But he said, when we actually realized that we could begin to trust each other and have real friends, he goes, it's like water in the desert. I mean, when it kicks in, it's powerful. Well, from there, then you start going, work together. The Christians in a lot of these countries are really tiny minorities. So it's like, what's the point of being isolated? Why don't we work together? So for example, in southern India, this is one of the encouraging stories. The ministry people in Chennai area, one of the big cities in southeast India, they said, yeah, let's start working together. How can we come together to reach this community? And it was guys out of Asian Access who originally got the idea, but they expanded it to the whole city. It includes ministry people and business leaders. They get together monthly. I sat in on one of their monthly sessions, and they are just constantly trying to figure out collective ministry efforts into Chennai that they can do public, into the business world and so on. So it's a great example of they're going, yeah, better together. When we can become unified, look at all the good stuff that can happen. So, but it starts with that initial breaking down the barriers and people willing to let their guard down and begin to trust each other.
It's been our delight today to be speaking with Noel Becchetti, Vice President of Leadership Development at Asian Access and editor of the project that we've been discussing today, Eastern Voices Volume 1, Insight, Perspective, and Vision from Kingdom Leaders in Asia in Their Own Words. Thank you so much, Noel, for being with us today.
Thank you.